thank you for tuning in and welcome everybody to the fifth seminar of the second edition of the I-LanD seminar series, Critical Perspectives on Social Media and Discourse, which I'm really honored to kick off. But before moving on, I'd like to wish you a wonderful year ahead, of course, and I'd like to thank those of you who attended the previous seminars, and those who couldn't, or those who'd like to rewatch them. They're available on YouTube, and this is especially for our students. So you can find the link on Facebook. Just visit I-LanD Research Center on Facebook to get the link and stay up to date with the initiatives promoted by the Research Center. And as usual, please be reminded that the meeting is being recorded. And I'll take the floor later at the end of the seminar to tell you more about the next seminar. But now it's time for me to leave the floor to today's lead host, and I'm beyond honored to introduce Majid Khosravinik, senior lecturer in digital media and discourse studies at Newcastle University, is interested in the intersection of social media technologies, discourse and politics, working through a social media CDS understanding. Majid's work includes the theorization, characterization, and adaptation of critical discourse studies on a range of topics, among these, digital national gender, ideological identity, digital populism, immigration, nationalism, political communication, etc. Majid is a founder and convener of the Newcastle Critical Discourse Group and sits on the board of the Journal of Language and Politics and Critical Discourse Studies, as well as serving as an expert reviewer for ERC actions, including Marie Curie individual fellowships, combating digital misogyny, Islamophobia and racism, British ESRC, and several other international research funding organizations. His most recent work pertains to the integration of analysis of technology and discourse under the notion of discursive analysis as a model for the critical analysis of digital discourse formation and perception. So thank you for accepting our invitation, Majid, to host the seminar, and the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Francesco, for that very elaborate and nice introduction. Thank you, and Giuseppe, for inviting me to this, and it's really an honor to be among old and new colleagues. This is always fun to talk about social media discourse. I'm hearing a beeping sound. I'm not sure if it is on my side or is some. Do you guys hear that as well?
Yes, I think it's people ping in to get in.
Okay, so it's no problem.
Yeah,
okay,
I think so.
Yeah. Okay. Good. So I'm just going to give you a quick note on the way I see the field. I mean, obviously you guys are supposed to bring in the input really, and we want to listen to you guys. But for me, I look at social media and the way that impacts discursive production and consumption in a very brief sense. And when we're doing discourse analysis, we're always looking at language in use, the way language was put in use, i.e. the way the meanings were constructed. And by extension, obviously, we don't only mean language, we mean all the other multimodal meaning-making artifacts and everything, which is, for me, being in a media and communication department all of my full-time career, it goes without saying that we are talking about any content through which we make meanings, and of course, language being the most sophisticated one among those. And we're always talking about bringing that into the social context, other than that, if you don't do that, we are not going to really be doing discourse analysis. And that's one of the key concepts and key notions that we agree on in discourse analysis. I mean, something was always missing in this, and we're always also talking about technologies of production of discourse. When it comes to media discourse analysis, for example, we in circles of CDA were not always talking about the norms and forms and maybe political economy and operational aspects of the way media technology is impacting that discourse that we are analyzing, because we were relying mainly on people who were doing that kind of research in media communications, and there were huge host of different kinds of research and theories we could draw on and bring into our discourse analysis and contextualize our understanding, which was for the right reason. But with the advent of social media, and the lag between what was happening on the ground and the conceptualization, which always had to play catch up, for me, if we were to continue doing CDA, we didn't have enough emphasis and pause on the way that social media is impacting this body of language in use, and the way it is not only in terms of the genre, which is huge amount of research on it, and that's one of the areas which I think we have done really well, but also in terms of how it impacts distribution and how in general impacts the processes of production, distribution, and consumption of discourses. And maybe also because I ended up, I'm trained as linguist, obviously, at Lancaster, but then I ended up in my media and communication studies. I was drawn more into trying to see what we can do in terms of establishing or at least tackling the problem of how these new media technologies are impacting discursive production and consumption and distribution. That's why I kept talking about this and writing about this. So in that triangle, I see now the discourse on top of the triangle, then we have society, and it's always there. But now, if we want to do social media CDS, as far as I'm concerned, we have to look at the triangle, and the new angle being the digital side. Like we have to do our discourse analysis and then put it in the first level of digital contextualization, or the other way around, and then go to the social theory or social context, which we have always been very good at in CDS, really. I've tried, to write about this and try to basically raise questions rather than answering them. But also, recently I've come to this understanding that maybe we are not really doing, because it is about meaning making, analysis of meaning making, maybe we should be doing something which looks at technology as part of the discourse. As in, there is meaning making by the way of practice. There is meaning making by the way that there is patterns in what you do online, and in the way that technology may be implicated in not only manipulating but also producing that meaning making. For example, we just plugging in my new book, in a new book that is coming out. I have recently edited with John Benjamins, as Johnny would know. There is a research where the researcher is actually looking at how geolocation signing ins were used as discursive material, which is obviously a new affordance of social media. So that then I thought that maybe we should be talking about techno-discursive analysis, where we analyze the technology of communication, i.e. in this case social media, as well as a discourse, which is obviously very important for us because we are focused on that really. In the introduction of special issue on social media CDS, I have actually tried to put some bullet points in terms of what this means in terms of parameters or in terms of methodology and in terms of what kind of area we want to cover and what not to cover, or some of the assumptions which we should be working on in that sense. Obviously, that's not restrictive. It's just my developing thoughts on that really. So I didn't mean for this to even get this long really, but I think that suffices for this. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to introduce our esteemed speakers, and then let you guys do your presentation, and then obviously we will have hopefully a nice chat afterwards about in and out of your research and what it means for CDS and social media. Okay, so I got some notes. Okay, so our first speaker would be Professor Paolo Catanocci, who is a full professor of English at the University of Milan. Her research over the last 15 years has revolved around discursive self and other presentation of identities, with more recent focus on corporate strategies of self-legitimation and performance of identity work at corporations, which is a very developing and important area. She focuses on the impact of social media and such discourses in terms of case studies, as well as trying to think about and theorize new theoretical constructs which are required for the new environment. She has published her work on many international journals, including the recent work in Discourse, Context, and Media. She'll be providing a brief longitudinal overview of the topics that researchers in her generation have covered in their careers, trying to account for the changes occurring in the contemporary media landscape. She will also discuss a couple of key constructs in relation to analyzing social media discourse, namely the notion of argumentative polylogue and strategies of network argumentation, which I find very interesting to listen to. So looking forward to hearing your talk. Then we'll move on to Professor Michelangelo Conoscetti, who's a full professor of English language and linguistics at Department of Culture, Politics and Society at University of Turin. His main research interests include the analysis of political and military discourse. He has designed an approach known as critical reverse language engineering to investigate military discourse, connecting for social media side ethnography, political discourse analysis, and corpus-based data mining, which I find absolutely interesting to listen to, and I hope we get some aspects of that in this talk. He has published a number of monographs. I'm not going to go over all of them, but more recent ones, Reframer, an analysis of Barack Obama's political discourse, which came out in 2011. Recently, he has published the military's approach to information environment, which was published by Routledge, Handbook of Disinformation, which I assume is another publication, which is a forthcoming one. Another one is NATO Social Media Strategic Communication in Making, which came out in 2018, and Big Data, Small Data, Broken Windows, and Fear Discourse, Brexit, the EU, and Majority Illusion, which also came out in 2018. Then we move on to Massimiliano De Mata, who is an associate professor of English linguistics at the University of Turin. He has just come back from an exciting adventure in the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. We are all following what was happening, where he was awarded a Lady Davis visiting professorship. And from February, he will be a research fellow at the Collegium de Lyon, where he will be leading a research project on conspiracy theories and social media. He has been working on and publishing on political and media discourse, populism, Donald Trump, social media discourse, and conspiracy theories. Particularly, his latest monograph came out entitled Discourses of Borders and the Nation in the US, a discourse historical analysis, which was published by Routledge, and another co-edited volume which came out with John Benjamin, entitled as The Conspiracy Theory Discourses, which is a huge volume, and a lot of people in the field are finding it very absolutely useful and necessary. Then we'll move on to Johnny Unger, who is a lecturer at Department of Linguistics and English Language at Lancaster University, which is also where I did my PhD. So we are kind of classmates. It's good to see you again, Johnny. His research critically examines the relationship of language and power in two main areas, both related to identity, language policy, and digitally mediated politics. His publications include The Discursive Construction of Scots Language, which came out in 2013, and a co-authored textbook, Researching Language and Social Media, which came out in 2014, 16, but there's a new edition of that which is coming out in 2022, the second edition of that. His most recent journal article is a co-authored article in Applied Linguistics Journal entitled Language Testing in the Hostile Environment, the discursive construction of secure English language testing in the UK, which came out in 2021. That is it. I'll just now hand it over to you, Paula, and then we'll do our input, and then we go for a chat afterwards. Over to you, Paula.
So thank you very much for your introduction, and thank you. I wish just to thank you everybody for being here and for inviting me to this seminar. And actually, I'm quite excited to be the first one to start. But unfortunately, Majid has said a lot of things that I meant to say myself. So I'm very happy that we're aligned and we are probably on the same page with this. But I hope I won't repeat myself too much in respect of what Majid just said. And I said I would cover something vaguely longitudinal because I thought that maybe some younger researchers would be attending this seminar, and I think that it's also quite important to see where the current tools that we are using to work on social media actually come from. And there's quite a long-standing research trail that goes back to, I would say, to the early noughties, when we started looking at ways to analyze language in this changing landscape. I see social media as a result of a digital evolution and revolution. And it has been posing, this kind of revolution has been posing challenges since its inception over 2 decades ago. And I think that research projects in the mid-noughties that I was engaged with aimed at developing and adapting some analytical toolkits for the analysis of computer-mediated discourse at the beginning, and of course most of you would probably be familiar with Susan Herring as well, who also emphasized in later research that what we were doing at the time was using more or less traditional approaches to language and discourse to analyze online interaction. And this is where what Majid said about taking stock of the technological aspects is also very important, and it wasn't necessarily being done at the beginning. We just transferred to the online environment some of the tools that we would normally use, and of course that was not enough. There were a lot of challenges that were with the notion of text, for instance, hypertext posing huge challenges to that. How do you create cohesion across higher such as that of Jean, where because so how do you say strict but recognizable structure, and that no longer applies. And then with the advent of social media, we all deal with dialogism and interaction in real time occasionally, or deferred time, both things. So another challenge, how do you analyze that in respect of something which is static but it's not? The normal interactional tools, would they be suited to this sort of analysis? There's also a lot of there is dialogism, but there's also a lot of diversion and this interaction, and in social media as well. How do you follow a thread and then threads go off in a zillion different directions? So we realized there was an increasing relevance of a whole lot of factors that have to do with language and interaction, is that embodied and embedded in texts in different places in society is not new either. But what happens is, like with social media, this happens, but it's basically on steroids. Everything happens at a much larger scale. And also the technological aspect, when we realize that the affordances of the medium foster the emergence of new communicative practices, and these practices are important to study. And because they are technology enhanced, the research methods that we need to develop we have to take stock of these technological affordances and of the constraints. We have to take those into consideration. And so we are encouraged. We have to work with experts from other fields, for instance. So transdisciplinarity becomes mandatory. Contextual aspects, the aspects that relate to practices, are particularly important. And I think that a lot of media is increasingly interested in looking at communicative practices, which are part of what is being communicated. So, for instance, how information spreads. Some of the recent research that dealing with conspiracy theory. And also more recently, I just finished writing a paper on misinformation. Practices are very, very important. You need to extract patterns from what is increasingly becoming a lot of data, you need qualitative investigation, but quantitative investigation is also extremely important. I have recently been looking at a lot of research, for instance, in natural language process analysis, designed to identify a number of aspects of social media interaction, of social media practices, and the way in which discourse evolves, also from a technological point of view, maybe not so qualitative, but definitely quantitative, with a lot of very interesting insights. I think that the problem that scholars try to address, for instance, in research on conspiracy theories and fake news, is how do you ways of detecting, because that's something that we're interested in. How do we spot these sort of things? And of course, one way is to look at the way in which they spread, and then you've got the kind of networks through which they're spread, and their linguistic makeup. But they're all bound together. You can't consider a single factor. You've got to look at all these different factors which have to do with practices and with the language that emerges and informs those practices. And that is really interesting. One thing that I noticed, that I may be wrong here, and probably some people would not agree with what I'm saying, is that what a lot of research that is grounded in natural language processing and sentiment analysis and that sort of thing, I successfully identifies certain types of discourses, certain aspects of certain discourses, but does not understand the motivations behind it. So I'm really interested in saying, okay, I can recognize that something is fake news, conspiracy theories have certain features, but how do I really deeply understand those in terms of the social function they have, and how do they emerge from social practices? And this is something that when we look at the surface, a neural network won't be able to do that. And that's why we need to go behind that and look at that. And in respect of misinformation, for instance, I was just reading over the last few days an extremely interesting paper by Musi and Reed, 2022, and they were discussing that they work on misinformation, and they work within a digital environment, and using statistical methods to study the way in which misinformation is actually embedded in text. But they take a perspective which is grounded in argumentation analysis. They look at fallacies, because they say that what is missing in a lot of research that is being done in that area is the explanatory power. So you recognize something, you see there's something, if it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, then it's got to be a duck. But then what makes that duck? And that's something which I find particularly interesting. And why am I interested in I think that we're moving towards what Shoup et al. Have called a pragmatic web, or a web of opinion, and social media are increasingly in. And this new communication technology that we're using are changing the way we process information. I'm quoting from Tini here, the way in which we learn, make decisions, create and distribute. And it's important to realize that socio-technical information systems such as websites or the use of the way in which social media interact can actually change or alter or reinforce attitudes, and this becomes very important for the analysis of political text discourse, for instance. And if you think of persuasion and argumentation, typically that is associated with a sort of linear. Whereas here we've got a really strong pragmatic component, and it's not anything that you can study from the point of view of how you develop an argument. The arguments come to you from all over the place, and this is what we mean when we talk about argumentative polylogs and the fact that argumentation is networked. So you have different discourses, and sometimes these discourses are deliberately built strategic bits and pieces for instance, and the discourse that emerges is very much fractured, but at the same time it also brings together different, can be more persuasive because it is dispersed and because it will talk separately to different groups of people having different concerns or different interests or different types of involvement with that topic. I think I'm going to stop here because I've stayed within my 10 minutes. So thank you very much. I hope I've just given you an overview of what I find interesting in social media discourse.
Thank you very much. That was great, really. Moving on to our next speaker, Michelangelo.
Yes. Good afternoon. Thank you, Paola, and thank you, Majid, and all the people at Orientale for inviting me. I will try to do my best to stay in the 10 minutes, of course, but to be as informative as possible to such a heterogeneous audience. First of all, I would like that I will bridge some of the things that you already said, you, Majid, and Paula as well. And this is quite encouraging because it means that, and it's important, we are on the same page. First of all, while Majid, you were introducing the discussion and the relationship of this, the production of this information in this media, I was thinking about Fairclough when he was saying we have to adopt a kind of Marxist approach to understand the way the economics and the politics of information is generated. And I fully agree. And I agree even with Paula when she said that nowadays the complexity of the scenario is such that we really need something that is complex, sophisticated, because, and we can just give an example. While we were here trying to understand what was going on in the social media and in the sphere of hate speech or whatever, there were actors, very powerful and rich actors. One on the one side of the Atlantic, that was Mr. Trump, for example. On the other side, there was Mr. Putin, that they were really intoxicating our social media communication, and not only in our public debate here in Europe. And at the moment, we see what is the result of that peculiar poisoning of the social media environment and then consequently our society. Let's start from a point, or at least what is my point. Paula was mentioning the beginning of computer-mediated communication. We were very young. I remember we published as young researchers something on the beginning of what was some of the special interest groups on the internet, etc. My first concern was about military communication, even at the time, parallel diplomacy, or what was then public diplomacy and virtual diplomacy. And it was evident that we were depending on technologies and IT people as well. This is the second issue that I would like to point out. We have to realize, and especially since we are even addressing young colleagues and will-be colleagues, I believe that especially today, if we want to work in this area of discourse analysis, and then we could name out so many possible acronyms for critical discourse analysis. I mean, there are so many analyses, but let's take for granted that in a way or in another, we have the same goal. Like the Taoists say, different religions try to go on top of the mountain. What is important is that we go on top of the mountain. I would say that today is extremely important that we are able first to have a real dialogue with the people who are able or develop the technologies. Not by chance, if we want to understand how to make use of neural networks or other technologies in order to collect data, not just how information is spread, but even how to bend the technology to our own interest. Because let's face it, until a few years ago, it was very easy to build the corpus, for example. It was enough to collect from a number of websites, etc. Today, let's imagine if we want to analyze, like it was the case of recent work, together with some military institution, telegrams, channels, etc. You can't imagine to go there and cut and paste and collecting in a random way or whatever. So interdisciplinarity is key today, and is not just something that, as usual, we should use to show that we are willing to understand the others, etc. But it's a kind of cooperation. So this has implications even for our academic careers in a way. Paradoxically, I'm in a department that is culture, politics, and society. We have technicians working with us. We have political scientists, etc. In the recent past, I published in very appreciated and very well listed journals, etc. Then the problem is that I'm so interdisciplinary because it's political science, etc., that they don't count for my scientific sector. But I'm sure I'm doing interdisciplinarity. But this is just part of the problem. I would like to focus, as I said, on technologies. I just give you an example. Probably you heard that one of the head of the police in Iran was captured, arrested, etc., because the moral police discovered that he had secret chats with people from the resistance on an Xbox. For example, a lot of interesting political communication, military goes through channels that we cannot imagine or are very difficult to be detected. We had an MA dissertation, now is a PhD work on this, just to give an idea of how technology is by far years ahead in front of us in a way. There are ways that determine what is the public debate that we cannot imagine and are still not under our radar. Let's put it this way. This means that we have to focus on actors, but I also imagine that this is always my preoccupation, not just as an academic, as a former marketing manager, that we have to make our research usable and useful for people. And my concern then is for possible users, or if you prefer customers, or if you prefer target audiences. Since I work a lot with the European Commission on the one side and NATO, I'm always wondering how we can really make a difference for them and helping them to understand that our research is not just some people playing with nice categories or nice software just for the sake of playing, but that can make a difference. And again, I stress this point. We are just facing now the effects of misinformation in certain social media spheres that has been there at least since 2014. Some of the ideas that I'm working on at the moment. One is the language of the neighborhood. I called in this way to make it simple for my possible target audiences that are mainly military and political decision makers at European level. It's the ability that certain software give us to determine what's going on in the public discourse sphere with software that can determine at zip code level. Today, you can be able to decide, given a particular zip code or a particular area, what is the language that is used in social media at that specific moment. This is what I call the language of the neighborhood. We have to decode it, we have to understand it, and if necessary, to replicate it in order to be, let's say, good communicators, or if you want, to try to understand how we can try to show what is the influence of that language. And sometimes it can be useful because it can be used to counter-inform audiences that are subject to misinformation. This is part of the resilience concept. It's part of the doctrine of several NATO countries at the moment that are very concerned how civilians and the military can be protected by misinformation. This means that we have to play a role like trust builders because we work in complex adaptive systems. We go back to what Majid was saying, and Paula. The framework is so complex and the game is so complex that we have really to make people aware that we are dealing with complex adaptive systems, and the adaptive means that they change a lot, they change frequently, and they change very fast, to the point that the technology is driving this change. Sorry. And I will finish, because it's 9 minutes now, with a quotation by Karl Rove. Karl Rove was George W. Bush senior advisor and chief political strategist. And in an interview with Ron Suskind, he talked about what was a particular kind of reality. And he says, in what we call the reality-based community, which he defined as people who believe that solutions emerge from your judicious study of discernible reality. And the interviewer nodded and murmured something about enlightenment principles and empiricisms. And he cut me off. That's not the way the world really works anymore, he continued. We are an empire now. And when we act, we create our own reality. And while you are studying that reality judiciously, as you will, we'll act again, creating other new realities, which you can study too. And that's how things will sort out. We are history actors, and you, all of you, scholars, will be left just to study what we do. Well, I hope that in a way, with our contributions, we can try to unlock or break this particular chain that Karl Rove was defining as the new empire. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Michelangelo. That was really interesting. I think we'll circle back to some of the points you raised. We are now moving over to Massimiliano. Over to you.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah, fine, yes? Okay. Yeah, thank you very much, Majid. Well, it's quite, well, in a sort of way, no, well, not embarrassing, but rather, I would say, difficult to come after Majid, Paula, and Michelangelo, because they have somehow set the scene or set the agenda, so to speak, in many ways. And in fact, I found Michelangelo's last quotation particularly apt, so we can create our own reality, which in many ways is what happens in the digital environment. In fact, I remember the earlier discussions on the digital discourse. We're talking about 10 or 20 years ago, when people would say, "Oh, but that's digital reality. That's kind of that's digital. That's not true. It's something which is different from reality. It's something that is totally virtual." That's the other word that was used very often. Well, I probably everybody agrees with that. I found that difference having less and less sense as time goes by. And in fact, we do have realities that have been kind of created through and by social media increase more and more. That's why I found Michelangelo's quotation from Karl Rove, which I seem to remember, in fact, particularly useful in this context. I would like to somehow to mention one particular aspect of the discussion on social media, which I'm kind of becoming increasingly familiar with, and as a way of, as Majid said catching up between theory and practice, so to speak, which is in fact the notion of manipulation, which is somehow very close to reality building or constructing. And I think it is an issue that somehow impinges on the quality and of the contents which are currently spread on social media. And what I'm going to say now, and I haven't checked the time, so okay, I've done it right now, but I will kind of fly around and about Majid's own work on social media and authority and social power, which I find particularly effective. In fact, I think that the structure of social media in this sense raises questions on the quality and the diffusion of contents and how these contents affect what I would call knowledge volition, so to speak. So the way people want to, if and when they want to, gain information, its quality, reliability, veridicity. Raising questions, I would like to raise questions in that sense on the epistemological positioning of textual production in social media, which, as I'm coming on the heels of the conspiracy theory discourse volume, which Paola contributed to, that Majid kindly mentioned in his presentation, I find a particularly interesting and central and concern in our discussions on social media. So, in other words, what I often ask myself when I deal with the discourse in a digital environment is, what is the role of the evidentiality in discourse? So how do we structure and claim reality in the digital environment? So how can social media produce, reproduce, or indeed create certain realities which are virtual, but then somehow leak into reality and becoming physical reality themselves? So how are contents manipulated? So if we no longer have indeed a gatekeeper, if we no longer have a source of authority, which is quite obvious, as Majid would say, in the populist environment, how do we rely on what can be called the prosumer's contents? Because of course, as we know, digital media is characterized by the idea that everybody can create contents on a kind of horizontal structure of networked users. Which apparently the context has been problematized by Majid itself, apparently lacks or challenges authority. This set of questions is particularly important indeed in the context of certain popular phenomena taking place in social media, such as fake news, misinformation, disinformation, and indeed conspiracy theories, which are often, of course, condemned because of their rather dubious epistemological status. But of course, these are issues that impinge also on social reality, on the public sphere. They have like very strong consequences. We can see them, and in fact, as I would see it, so the affective and the algorithmic architecture and affordances of social media encourage, or at the very least endorse, manipulation of contents. And this manipulation is particularly important when we talk about news and important facts about the public sphere, of course, including science, as we have seen in the last few years. So now, in critical discourse studies, manipulation is a concept which has been traditionally used to explain how the ruling classes exercise their power by constructing certain discursive contents that go against the interest of the dominated classes. But of course, this is based on a hierarchical top-down framework, which, of course, in the environment of social media needs to be somehow revised. An environment, as I mentioned before, which is horizontal and seemingly egalitarian. So a communicative framework where anybody can manipulate, indeed, and be given credit. So in a way, the non-linear logics of production and influence of social media demands a revision of the concept of manipulation in that respect. So that's one of the ways that I'm finding quite interesting. So the way we problematize a certain archetypal concepts in critical discourse studies in the light of, indeed, a new literacy itself. So manipulation of social media that, of course, can be achieved by manufacturing contents and users. So a partially invented story, a manipulated news item, or a conspiracy theory may be promoted through, of course, troll factories that, of course, Michelangelo is very familiar with, or bots, or fake accounts, and so on. What I find particularly interesting is the way fake news and conspiracy theories, in many cases, not always, but in many cases, actually mimic legitimate news and legitimate contents. So fake, and that's something that Paula herself actually mentioned in her discussion on how difficult it is actually very often to trace differences and to track differences in terms of language, verbal and non-verbal language between let's say legitimate and non-legitimate news. So fake news, conspiracy theories construct legitimacy by including what seems to be actual true information, and we can see in fact that thanks to the affordances of social media. Indeed, this happens because these affordances are particularly prone to becoming instruments of manipulation. And this happens, for example, in the construction of multimodal texts, for example, on Twitter. So what is being, and this is what I noticed in a couple of things that I'm working on at the moment that will be published soon. So the verbal message is actually confirmed somehow by video, by data, by statistics, by meme, and so on and so forth. So in a way, photos, videos, memes, and links to external websites or retweets. So all the affordances that we find in social media are actually forms of recontextualized and shared contents, and they are in themselves forms of quotations. So issues of intertextuality and interdiscursivity, of course, are indeed a part of the picture in itself. And the purpose of these quotations, in fact, is to create and communicate credibility and objectivity, as we know from like a long line of studies, of course, in critical discourse studies. So the news item, okay, just to give you an example, will not appear as coming from the writer's own voice, but appears as validated by evidence and facts coming from external authorities. So there's a huge literature, of course, on how news is created and constructed in that sense. So the other important thing, of course, is that the affordances of social media, in the affordance of social media is the connection of quoting and sharing. So contents are shared, are spread, often virally, attracting users that share the same worldview. And indeed, on Twitter and on other social media, sharing and quoting tend to converge. And in fact, content creation and content sharing are activities based on users' engagements. And in fact, this is part of what happens in terms of, and why it happens in terms of the affordances themselves that we find on social media, for example, on through hashtags and retweets on Twitter. So sharing contents, legitimizing each other's opinion, engaging with each other. Okay, so in terms of groups of networked users. Is something that leads to legitimizing each other's opinion and to delegitimize others' opinions. And in that sense, the evidential, the epistemic, the evidentiality in discourse that we find, for example, indeed through quotation, is a way of manipulating contents, and such manipulation can indeed be pervasive because of the architecture itself of Twitter and of the other social media. I would say, just to finish, because I'm probably running out of time, is basically as a kind of stimuli for discussion rather than concluding remarks. I would probably say that number one is that manipulation in discourse is manifested especially when polarized political views occur. Needless to say, everything is polarized, and the emotional architecture of social media is built in order to somehow to foster that polarization. And this is when manipulation seems to be, this is both cause and effect of manipulation in that respect. And in fact, this takes us back to the connection. It takes us to the connection between social media and populism that Majid has mentioned in his presentation and in his work itself. The second point, the second remark that I would make is that the multimodal affordances of social media are crucial in constructing and delivering manipulated messages as a and that's because mainly non-verbal resources and as well as technological resources are used as evidence to legitimize conspiratorial messages or fake news. So we have an information architecture, which in a way is very prone to be the object of manipulation and of, indeed, as Michelangelo said, of creating realities. Thank you.
Excellent, thanks so much. There's so many ideas that we can circle back and discuss. I hope I don't end up manipulating all the time discussing all those points. Okay, moving on to Johnny now. Johnny, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Majid, and I'd also like to thank the organisers for inviting me to this really so far very fascinating discussion. I have the difficult task of going last, which means that, like everyone has said, pretty much everything that I might have wanted to address has already been addressed in some way. So I think I'll maybe just start by going right back to the beginning of when I first got interested in this topic. I think what got me interested was that I noticed that some colleagues, who I will not embarrass by naming them, were quite dismissive about social media, which we've just heard about from Massimiliano as well. And they would say things like, well, yes, fine, what happens on social media is interesting, but the political decision makers still read the newspaper every day, and that's what we should look at. And sort of, this is going back to the sort of first half of the noughties. Very clearly at that point there were already people from within critical discourse studies who were taking an interest in the digital. And a study that I often cite is Ruth Wodak and Scott Wright's study looking at a multilingual forum in the European institutions, which I think is sort of a good example of bringing in the digital into critical discourse studies. And then there were also people who were not necessarily sort of considered as core within critical discourse studies, like Ron Scollin, who worked on the digital for many, many years, going right back to the sort of just been muted somehow. Okay, there we go. So going back to Ron Scollin, who looked at very early what I consider social media, such as email groups and Usenet forums and things like that. And then, of course, a few of the names have already been mentioned, like Susan Herring, of course, who argued that critical discourse studies was one of the approaches that we could use to look at the digital. Yanis Andritsopoulos' work was also quite influential. Discourse-centered online ethnography, bringing some ideas from discourse studies together with sociolinguistics and ethnography. And then people like Crispin Thurlow and many other people who are sort of in this early period where the field was just sort of starting to emerge, I would say. So even though there were people who were dismissive, others didn't necessarily embrace every aspect of looking at the digital, but I'd say for the time we're quite visionary in thinking about it in different ways. Okay, so then maybe it's worth thinking about some of the key developments that some of these names I've just mentioned. And I think Majid and my chapter in Methods of Critical Discourse Studies, which we're invited to contribute by Ruth Wodak, sort of outlines some of these as well. So I think this point, which Massimiliano has already mentioned, that the digital is part of the real, perhaps, and Nathan Jurgensen talks about the fallacy of digital dualism, which I think is a very good way of thinking about it. At the time, this was around 2012, he published this. He noticed that a lot of people were, again, being quite dismissive of what happens in social media. And so he argued that we should think about digital media not as separate, virtual versus real life, but as a form of augmented reality. And he applied this in particular to an area that I became very interested in at the point, which was protests and resistance, political resistance. So he looked at how protesters use digital media to broadcast their location, for example, so that people can come to a place or stay away from a place if the police were there, things like that, and showed, I think, very convincingly that we can't see them as separate, which also provided an answer to the people who said, well, all this so-called activism online is just slacktivism or clicktivism or all these other trendy labels. Actually said, no, it's quite important to look at this. And this is something that Majid and I talked about in our chapter as well in relation to Tahrir Square, where we sort of looked at how photographs and images can kind of circulate from one context and be recontextualized in other contexts and then come back again. And so you had people holding up signs referencing the protests in Wall Street, the 99, what were they called? The 1%, etc., things like that. So there was kind of, via digital media, there were interdiscursive links and intertextual links between different protest movements, which I thought was very interesting. Another observation that is worth making, I think, is that we can have a broader or a narrower definition of social media, but however broad our definition, I think it's important to say that it's not just social media platforms and services, but the digital is now completely ubiquitous in all our lives. And as people who are interested in how power is enacted in society, it's really important to look at how this works behind the scenes, to look at the technology. And this is something that several people have already mentioned as well. The digital is ubiquitous, but as discourse analysts, I think we need to at least have some understanding of how the digital works and why certain things are seen. We need to understand things like attention economies. We need to understand ideas like echo chambers and filter bubbles, whether or not they actually exist, and they've been challenged in various ways. But at least we need to understand what people see, and that it's not the same as traditional media, where what is printed in a newspaper, okay, maybe there are a few editions that change a little bit, but on the whole, that's a fairly static text. So introducing this idea of dynamism to discourse and to texts that we study, I felt was quite important. One of the things that I became quite interested in is how we can collect data from people who are engaged in digital communication. And so in that same chapter I mentioned already, we talked a bit about online focus groups. And this sort of is also in line with the work that Yanis Androusopoulos was doing at the time, saying we need to actually talk to people, not just observe them. We need to understand them by getting their voices as well. And so I've thought about that for quite a while and tried to think about different ways of sort of bringing in different voices into our research as well. And then something that I think hasn't been mentioned or hasn't been mentioned much yet is ethics. And that's something that I think poses a real challenge to many researchers. And as we have, I think, moved on in the field, our understanding of the ethics of using social media data has become more nuanced. But, by no means is universal. And so I think there are colleagues who think it's perfectly acceptable to just use any data that is publicly posted, whereas other scholars say, well, actually, perhaps that isn't really okay, just as you wouldn't, as a sociolinguist, just put a recorder in the middle of a crowded square and record everything people were saying these days. Maybe back in the 70s, people felt able to do that. So, things have been changing, and I have been quite influenced and inspired by the community around the Association of Internet Researchers, who come from a wide variety of different disciplines, and we've mentioned inter or transdisciplinarity quite a few times already today. But I think that from my point of view, that community has a very good discussion around ethics. Also understanding that it's not always straightforward, and that there may be cases where we do use data without informed consent, in some cases because it would be absolutely impossible to do the research otherwise, and the research may have some benefits. Okay, so I think I'd like to use a bit of my time to mention some of the really great work that some of my recent PhD students have done, which, to me, I have learned a lot from them about the various contexts that they were researching and the developments that they made to different fields. So the first former PhD student I'd like to mention is Aksa Issa, who wrote her PhD on terrorist recruitment materials, looking at Daesh. And she was particularly interested in sort of how multimodality and argumentation were used to make these materials persuasive. And one of the most interesting things about her thesis was how she dealt with ethics, which I've just mentioned. And I'd say I was struck by the emphasis that the ethics board at Lancaster placed on her safety and my safety as a researcher, which was a much bigger part of the ethics application than kind of thinking about the people whose data she was using in that case. So that's one student. Another student who finished a few years ago was Daniela Ibarra, who wrote about political TV talk shows in Chile and how Twitter users essentially argued with them. So she again was looking at argumentation, and she made some really interesting developments using Goffman's theories around interaction. And she developed this concept of hybrid play, which basically allowed for multiple conversations to be going on at the same time, in some cases interacting directly with the main actors, the TV producers or the people who were invited to the TV shows, and in other cases kind of bypassing them. So I thought that was a really interesting way of looking at this kind of data that sort of involved interplay between traditional media and digital media too. And then finally, a student who's just finished, Jess Aston, who some of you will have seen at Kadad and other conferences, I'm sure, whose thesis was on anti-feminist discourse on Reddit, again, looking at argumentation, and she's sort of developed, I think, a very nuanced understanding of the different topoi used by this anti-feminist community. And I think made some really important points as well about the kind of interplay between misogynistic and far right and other kind of ideological viewpoints that we as committed discourse scholars would seek to challenge. So just to finish off then, I wanted to mention two recent current projects I'm working on. One, which I've been working on again with Jess Aston, is around polarization, is to do with polarization around trans rights on Twitter. Now, of course, Twitter is a very interesting place at the moment for various reasons. And this brings me to the other project, which I'm working on with Marina Nicepore, who is well known to you in Naples. And what we're looking at there is how and why Twitter users have decided to move to Mastodon in particular, which I'm sure some of you have already explored. And so both these recent projects are kind of looking at how ordinary people, ordinary social media users are in a way engaging in a sort of grassroots movement to challenge the centralized power of social media institutions and thinking about kind of how the concepts of power and hegemony, which we know very well from traditional discourse studies, kind of play out in situations where we have these kind of centralized institutional actors, social media companies, versus decentralized networks of users, whether they create their own affordances, as people do on Twitter through the use of hashtags and other means, or whether the decentralization is built into the platform itself, as is the case with Mastodon. So watch this space. We hope to have some interesting findings for you in the near future. And I think that probably takes me to about 10 minutes, so I will stop there and hand back to Majid. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Johnny. We will go back to that notion of argumentation and social media as one of the areas that I really want to explore with you guys really. So I'm not sure actually now we go to the audience or we just pose questions ourselves. Francesco?
Yeah, you can pose questions yourselves or just among the speakers, or take questions from the audience as well. So in the meantime, you can ask questions among the speakers and take questions from the floor.
Yeah, can I just I'm very keen and I have to ask my question. Just one question, maybe it's relevant to Paula and what Johnny was saying. Actually got other questions as well, but because there's this link here. When we talk about argumentation as one of the areas where we do in CDA, obviously there are different ways of doing this. You can go to pragma dialectics and that way of analyzing, or the going to the warrants and what is evidence and deconstruct the argumentation like that, or topos and discourse historical approach, which is what I have used as well in my previous research anyway, and what I have done an argumentation analysis, it was not on social media. So when we did the first case study on social media, and we wanted to do discourse historical approach, like looking at the referential strategies, naming strategies, and predicational strategies, and then argumentation analysis, we did come to a point where we thought, and this was 2013 actually. The research was about 2012, but it got published in 2014 really. By the time that we got to the argumentation level, we thought that there is no argumentation, as in a classic sense of it, you know. And in that paper, we do actually say that argumentation, in a sense of, you know, proper warrant evidence, say because this is like that, because of this, because of that. We don't see that, and at that time we argued that, you know, there is no argumentation in that sense in social media because of the way the interaction is, the non-linearity of the movement of the discussions and all of that. So all those. I mean, now I've changed my point a bit, because I think there is still argumentation. It's just not that visible, you know, and. Yeah, I just wanted to see what you guys think about it, because as people who have actually done argumentation and social media.
John, do you want to go first, or shall I?
Up to you. You're very welcome.
No, you go first. You go first, maybe from a discourse historical approach, which is not what I'm doing, that may be more relevant.
Yeah. Well, I think that I'd say that the affordances and the context obviously shape the nature of the discursive strategies used in different texts. And so, you know, when you first looked at social media back then, you know, there were very different affordances and different practices as well. Just thinking about Twitter, since that time, the word limit, the letter limit increased from doubled. From 140 to 280. And of course, there's lots of social media platforms that have much longer texts, such as Reddit, which I mentioned just before. And I think it's very clear that there is argumentation, but it takes a different form. Now, one of the things that I think is important to look at is not just the verbal text, but also the visual text. There's lots of visual argumentation across social media platforms. In fact, in some communities, I would say it's mainly visual argumentation. There's very little verbal happening. And then the other thing is, I think you need to look at how arguments are constructed over multiple posts, sometimes asynchronously, and also that they're co-constructed by different users. And I think Tumblr is a particularly good example of this, where you kind of get people layering and layering and layering until at the end you get something that definitely you can identify some of the main elements of an argument. But and the other thing, just to finish, is the kind of pragma dialectic understanding of argument, or most argumentation theory has these idealized schemas for arguments. And of course, we know even from other forms of language use that we rarely really follow those in every respect. So I think sort of looking at the data more in its context and thinking about the communities of practice involved and their typical practices. Sometimes an argument can be as little as a single emoji. Once you add it to what has been said before and the typical practices of these communities.
Yep.
Okay, if I may, yes, thank you. You mentioned a lot of the things that I would have mentioned as well. The idea is, I think that one of the consequences is that you break down argumentation into different components. So you've got a lot of different supporting arguments which are treated separately. And the thing is that you don't need to, if you're orchestrating this argumentation, and sometimes even if you're not orchestrating it and somehow it emerges from the polylog that you're analyzing, what happens is that some arguments will be valid, some others will not be valid for a certain audience or for a certain community constituency, but whatever is valid is taken on and maybe turned into something which is final about that kind of topic. And because it is broken down and networked in that way, it's very difficult to gain an overall view of it all, but at the same time you can find some points which speak to you, and therefore sometimes they can also be contradictory points. What I'm saying is that the idea that you've got this polylog which embraces a lot of arguments and counter arguments, and then maybe whatever wins is not an issue of argument, but whatever is posted more, reposted more, it's an issue of getting critical mass. But a lot of times you've got the arguments and the counter arguments, and well, another thing that I would like to mention is that arguments end up not being very convincing, because whatever you can you see as an argument, you can choose, you can pick and choose. So cherry picking is ideal in this kind of world. And you don't really come, and actually I would say that sometimes your final conviction is somehow not bound to argumentation, but it's pre-theoretical. So this is what I see a lot on social media. Say you argue a lot, you manage to keep all these strands separate, and because you hardly ever end up having something that sums it up. So that maybe, Majid, that was what you were referring to when you said there is no argumentation, but there is. The thing is that there isn't a clear standpoint, or you can't reconstruct the whole thing, or the whole thing is so spread out that you don't recognize it as an argument, but it is an argument, except that it doesn't work like an argument. And then you've got all the issue of rhetoric, what works better. And rhetoric is not only verbal rhetoric, but you could have, as John said, an emoji, which is more persuasive than anything else. So I think that this is one of the things that I think challenges theory. When I said, traditional theories are challenged by this sort of thing.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I do agree with that. I mean, as you mentioned in passing as well, this is also about I mean, you said that the arguments are not really valid, or they're not convincing, but they are convincing because to them, because it depends on how polarized the context of analysis is. And in our case, it was extremely polarized page. We were not looking at how they antagonize the others. It was really like-minded people talking about something, and we were looking for something else there. But so they didn't need to really to give arguments to each other. So it was like more like a key point just to mention this. For us, it was about Arab and Persian, the conflict, and it was like, oh, he's an Arab, and that's it. That's the whole argument, But as you said, there are key points where these are triggered, and it's just a new context and new ways of looking at which also takes us. I mean, I've decided to ask one question from which, and then we just hand over to our audience. Which this point links to what Massimiliano was saying about the affect side, which I think is extremely important, because the legitimation or acceptance of a half argument or truncated, irrelevant, even a stupid-looking argument works because there is affective relatability, because you relate better with that, and that's it, and it literally works like that you really think so much value in that argument, even though if you just think out of the box and you break it down, there's nothing that works coherently in that argument. So I wanted to ask Massimiliano, in terms of, when we talk about misinformation and social media, we are actually assuming that there is something that social media is bringing in this topic, because misinformation is not new, manipulation is not new, and it was happening before. And the impact that we're assuming that this is on the rise because of something that social media is doing in this. I just wanted you, if you could elaborate on that a bit and tell us what characterizes specifically the digital misinformation that we are inflicted on by in this time and age.
Yes. Well, one very easy answer to that would be that it's a kind of, it's a mixture of technological and semantic issues, so to speak. So what the technological one being the one that, of course, we don't need to turn the TV on nowadays because we have the news at our disposal. We don't look for news. What I call the knowledge volition, in a way, is something that should be elaborated on because news comes to us. So we go on social media and we hear about things, events that happen just by accident. Not even watching TV or looking at a news site. So, and that's the other reason, which is both technological and semantic, so to speak, is the fact that we watch news, we see news, we learn about news and contents and so on, which are important to the public sphere, to society, next to photos of cats or our friends and so on. So in other words, the kind of a more domestic or familiar side, the accessible, or even, shall we say, the more emotional or personal, subjective side of social media. So I think it is this mixture that somehow is inverted commas new. So the separation between the serious items, okay, so you watch BBC at 6, I think. So news at 6, you do the serious business, you do your dinner, you have your dinner in front of TV, separated from leisure. So I think that this separation is no longer existent. So I think that mixture of the serious and the banal, of the familiar, is what makes the information environment so unique and new, in my opinion. The other thing, in fact, I wanted to address something that that all of you actually mentioned, the issue of relevance. Because as Paula said, we look at kind of a building contents on social media, and through threads, through various social media. The other interesting thing that really impinges on issues of shall we call it digital and non-digital literacy, is the fact that very often when people discuss things on social media, they are not relevant to the topic that is in theory being discussed. I mean, even by through a cursory look at our own acquaintances on the social media, if we move beyond our inner circle, if we move beyond Johnny's page or Majid's page or Paula's page or Michelangelo's page, we look at exchanges, conversations, which are not always relevant to the, shall we call it, the initial topic. It kind of goes on and on and on, and until then, you actually get very far from the original topic, so to speak. So that's also like an issue which is very interesting. One might argue this happens, in conversation between friends. You meet at a pub and you start from talking about the latest Liverpool match, and then you move on talking about your children or whatever. But that's something that happens very often in social media as well. And I think there is what I've noticed empirically, I've not studied it thoroughly yet, is that a lot of people actually have problems in following the kind of what we would call the logical sequence of exchanges and conversations, and this also has a lot to do with what Majid was saying about emotions and the emotional side of things. And yeah, so
exactly. I mean, yeah, I do agree with that. And I mean, I think about whatever topic you throw at me, and in my module that I teach, I ask always as a student, okay, so in this topic, what is social media doing in this? Like, what is it that this aspect is bringing into this equation? And I think, as you mentioned, actually, there is a technological aspect for promotion of that kind of polarized misinformation, which is something that the attention economy of social media loves to do automatically, because that's the way algorithms work. So it gets to be promoted and be foregrounded, to use CDA vocabulary, is foregrounded to people. So people see that a lot and interact with that more. And I would say there is also a social aspect to that, which it remains to be discussed why this is happening, but we're assuming now that we are now more affective society than logical society, as in like affective relatability has won over argumentative rationality. This is something that I mentioned in my talk in Navarro University because a lot of debate. And I think we are now much effective, and that's partly, we would argue that partly because we are now getting our information and entertainment in a mixed form, as you said, but also because we do entertainment for affective part of it, not for logical argumentation. And then in the middle of that, we also have a political discussion going on. So we would like that to be similar to that, or we respond to that in that way, because we are now more affect prone kind of thinkers. And at the same time, like I have a PhD student who actually looking at Instagram as entirely affective area, because it's entirely on visual aspects. So that, TV has been talked about a lot in terms of the affective side. So TV is not really proper democratic media, but newspapers were, because it was mainly about rationality and logic and argumentation that it can put into words and everybody could argue. So we have these two aspects. You would argue that social media has caused this in the society, or society, I don't know, actually, it's a bit slightly media deterministic to say that, which is actually an idea that I am actually entertaining recently, because you can't deny the impact that this normalized way of getting information and entertainment and life and shopping and talking and everything, we're getting it through a mixture of a platform which is highly effective. So everything may become like. So I see a technological aspect to this for algorithmic, for example, regimentation of the content, and the affective side, which buys into that. It's like it's good. It makes sense because I like it that way better, really. I don't know if you want to add anything to that. If not, I have if anybody wants to add anything to that. Otherwise, I have another question from Michelangelo. Can I?
Yes, please,
maybe could I just briefly add one thing? Sorry, Michelangelo, were you going to address that point?
No, please, Unger. Then I will.
Yeah.
Sorry, Johan. Sorry, I will say something later. No problem.
Okay, yeah. So it's just to sort of pick up on what Majid finished with there, talking about algorithmic aspects, and relating that to what you said, Massimiliano, that yes, you can sort of very easily get to new territory if you're browsing the web. And this kind of, I think, fits with the notion that Jay Lemke developed, looking at the pre-participatory web of traversal, that you make your own meaning by looking at different texts. But actually, what happens nowadays on many platforms, and TikTok, I think, is a very good example of this, is that what you see is so incredibly shaped by algorithms that we have no insight into and no power over, that you don't actually know whether you're seeing something because it's popular at the moment, because you happen to discuss something on WhatsApp with a friend last week, because you click on certain things, because you are a male aged 44, who buys Lego minifigures or whatever it might be, So I think it's kind of lots of things that influence what we see, and that is a very, very powerful way of shaping our engagement with digital media. And it's, we can say things about sort of decisions made in smoky rooms in the past, in politics, in media, and so on. But now decisions are made by programmers and marketers and, the people who run the social media companies. And the impacts we can see all around us in different platforms and in things like the various events in the US that have happened recently, etc., etc. I could go on, but I don't want to take up too much time.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, exactly. Which is also problematizes the notion of this being a participatory web, really. At least these days, it's becoming more obvious. And I quite like the example you gave on TikTok, because in my class I always talk about TikTok as a fully algorithmically regimented platform, and that's actually their business model, and which that's why they are successful. Which is very interesting how powerful these gatekeepers, digital gatekeepers have become. Michelangelo?
Yes, no, I just wanted to follow on what you were saying. A few ideas. One is that to me, it's evident today that something that has changed in the way we have to analyze all of these phenomena is that once, more or less, we were targeting a specific medium or a specific way of literature, genre, or whatever, and that was. Today, it's a bit different in the same that the same speaker or actor can decline the same message in different ways according to the platform is using, especially on social media. For example, Obama was the first one that he was addressing the people at the National Democratic Conference in a way. Then he was going on YouTube, because at that time YouTube was extremely innovative, and the way he was dressing, the way he was speaking, the way he was moving was completely different. Nowadays, we could say so that not the medium is the message, but the social media platform is the message. And this entails a lot in the way we can analyze the language that is produced by the same actor in different ways, if there is a very good actor able to do that. For example, and again, then we had another point. There are different social platforms, and we really fail to appreciate how the bunch of all the platforms that are available to different actors and generations. For example, it's amazing, even in the classes, I don't know if it happens to you, but with my students in MA, for example, oh, but you are a boomer, so well, you know WhatsApp, you know icons, etc., but we communicate in a different way, and this is something that we should remember. I would like to recall, Majid, what you said about affective communication. I like this very much. I would like to see it in two different ways. One is, of course, the way of cognitive sciences and the way, of course, Lakoff and Weston explained how our brain works, etc. And of course, there is the visual stimulus that is working very well. But I would like to be provocative, and I would like to say that we are effective and our communication is effective because the medium is perfect for this kind of message, but because we are the target of psychological operations, in the sense that I agree with Johan that, of course, it's the computer scientists and engineers that develop softwares, etc. But there are people that are very good at exploiting these technologies. I would like, I try to share something. I don't know if I can, if I have let me see. Okay.
This is not part of how the seminar works, but we can make an exception, of course, if you have.
Yes, no, probably because it's following me, probably. But oh, sorry, no. But it's contributing. I just try and this is. Can you see it? This is the. This is the a slide from the military, for the military when they train officers on psychological operations. And as you can see, is the way they influence the cycle on behavior, from the information transmission to the sensible behavior. Can you see it?
Yeah.
Okay. So as you can see, vision is 83%, and it's just transmitting something at a visual level that can strongly influence the way we behave. So it was just to to give you an idea that sometimes we don't realize how we are part of a market. It's a market not just in marketing terms, but even on the way our emotions and our perceptions are marketed by others. And then again, for example, as Jon was saying, there are interesting reports on how big social media companies try to exploit and foster, of course, behaviors that will help their algorithms to gain more revenues from certain things, etc. In fact, someone was saying that it's not a problem giving particular rules as far as content is concerned, but as far as the algorithm is shaped, etc.
I mean, yeah, I totally agree. Yeah, and that's why I would assume that if you're doing a social media CDA or whatever you want to call it, and you're not talking about political economy of the platform that you're analyzing, you're not really understanding what is going on, because it's really difficult to claim the discursive power or discursive influence of something if you are not able to tell us how this is coming to you and why it is shaped the way it is and how many people are seeing that, what is the algorithm doing in this. So that's one of the problems, major problems that I sometimes see in CDA on social media, because I don't think this is really CDA, social media CDA. This is CDA on the data that you have gotten from social media. You know what I mean? Which is a recurring thing, and I totally understand, because it's easy to sit here and just complain about this and criticize people doing that, and then not really being able to really provide a very viable and easy solution for it, because I do say this thing, I try my best to explain what we can do or whatever, but obviously there is no solution. And which brings me to a question that I wanted, Massimiliano, did you want to say something? Okay, which brings me to the question I wanted to ask Michelangelo actually about the methodological approach, because as far as I'm concerned, in a bigger picture, when we do this corpus analysis, for example, or any kind of big data analysis, which I assume that you have done, it's really excellent. Specifically, corpus is really good, and it's useful and all that. But to me, that's if I may say this, use this word, it's a lower level part of the analysis. And before that, we have to do a lot of other things before we get to that. It's the analysis of the content that we have at hand. Okay, but before that, for big data, we can say this less. But in general, my understanding is that there's no way we can do this analysis without doing some sort of observational approach. Okay, because we have to capture the context of discursive practice, the meanings constructed and going. It's horrible. It's difficult to do. It's very messy, and at the end, you probably do not have a lot of statistical validity in what you want to claim. However, you cannot do without having that aspect, because what you would see, it will be detached from the context of production. And I noticed that you mentioned, I think on your CV, that you try to bring in ethnography into that, which is something that I also talk to students about as part of the different versions of digital ethnography that I assume that they should be doing. I wanted to see how you bring these two aspects together, like doing big data analysis and then bringing in observation or ethnographic analysis.
Well, thank you very much, Majid, for giving me the opportunity to clarify on this. Not by chance, one of the papers you quoted was big data and small data, and was about Europe, etc. No, in the sense that personally, this is in fact, this is what even Paolo was mentioning. I mean, to me, the quantitative analysis is important because when you have to state some general rules, this is very important because it will tell you, of course, you name something or phenomenon that is not just a single event, but it's something that has a regularity. So in this sense, this is where I like to have big data available. It's like making a dictionary, and so you can say, okay, this is the typical use of this word in this particular context, and that is. Then, of course, you need multimodal analysis and all the other things that we know. But to me, of course, first of all, I will quote what my old professor that was the chair of the language center in the lab where I was working. He was an old man, so with no particular computer skills, and he was always saying, before trying to use artificial intelligence techniques, we should start to try to use human intelligence. In this sense, I like the idea that the human intelligence is how can I approach the whole problem with my knowledge, with my ability to analyze. And in fact, this is why I talk about small data. I always tell people that when you are able to look at the final result, big data, things are already happened. The point is that you have to be able to anticipate. And if you have to anticipate, you have to be able to understand what in the small data will bring the change that will lead to the big data. So it's the rule of the 1-9-90. 1% of the people generates the content, 9% will contribute to spread it, and 90 will use and spread, etc. So I'd like to be normally in the focusing on the 1 or on the 9. Then, of course, if you have to explain why the 90% is accepting and using, etc., etc., etc. I give you a completely different example, but is exactly what sometimes we can do in terms of trying to help decision makers to decide on something. And this is partly of even what Johan was referring to. In 2018, for example, for the first time, the Joint Research Center of the Commission was very close, together with NATO top ranks, to generate a center that was to study, and they had already had hardware, software, whatever you needed. They had a kind of agreement to have a center to analyze Russian propaganda on the European space. So from an academic point of view, it was done. From a, let's say, organizational point of view, it was done, but it was vetoed by Germany, because Germany didn't want to upset Mr. Putin with a center that was going to study his propaganda, etc. And that is the result. So when we talk about that, there is more, as you were saying, about what we observe, etc. And that was the case. A perfect plan that was stopped, vetoed by a single country. And as you know, in the European Union, you need unanimity. I feel this is the problem. And paradoxically, this goes back to what you were saying, big data on the one side, but I perfectly agree with you. I like to have a kind of data-driven approach. I like the corpora to tell me what is reality, so that I'm not biased, etc. But of course, I have my hypothesis-driven approach. But
yeah, exactly.
It's good to have data that support you.
Exactly, of course, yeah, of course. It's just there's no absolute objectivity anyway, and yeah, I totally agree with that, and that's what I would like to do. I mean, but I try to bring in other people who actually know about the big data side into the research area too. So if you all agree, I'm going to open the floor to the audience and to see if there are any questions there. Any questions? Comments?
While we wait for questions, I would like to remember and quote the famous, if you torture the data long enough, it will confess to anything. So that's why we should be very careful about the way we use that.
Exactly.
Okay, I'd have a question myself, but I don't know, maybe we can wait for since we don't have much time. If there are any questions from the floor? Or maybe I can ask mine. So my question concerns the ethics that John mentioned. Are there any international standards, or does it depend on the source of the data? So, or I don't know, the publisher or the individual? You know, should you ask for permission to, I don't know, to somebody to publish, to reproduce the data, or are there any international standards you can rely on?
I can have a go at answering that. So I don't think there are any universally accepted international standards. What I would say is that pretty much all universities now in the UK, the US, Australia, Canada, and a number of other countries have ethics review committees or ethics review boards, and all research which involves human or animal participants has to go through an ethics review process. So I think that isn't universal, but it's pretty widespread in the academic context I'm familiar with. Now, if we're talking about within the community of scholars who research language and the internet, I think there are two sort of main sources that I would direct my own students to. One is the Association of Internet Researchers ethics guidelines, which are now in their 3rd version, and they're working on the 4th version. And the other is, for students working in the UK at least, there's the British Association of Applied Linguistics, which has a set of guidelines for collecting data and using it in an ethical way. But, you know, this does vary by national context. I know that there are many universities around the world where ethics is essentially up to the researchers. You mentioned journals and publishers. Certainly there are journals who require you to submit an ethics statement together with your publication. But there are many journals who don't do that either. I think journal reviewers sometimes ask questions about ethics. I certainly do when I'm reviewing things. And similarly, in the book series I edit, which Majid mentioned before, if there was a submission involving social media data of a sensitive nature or a private nature, and there wasn't any attention to ethics, that's something I would flag up as a series editor as well. But yeah, no, I don't think there are universal rules or guidelines. Okay. I think actually as critical, I meant to say this, I don't think I did, as critical discourse scholars, I think we should actually really be thinking about ethics, and we should be thinking about the impact of our research on marginalized groups in particular. So if we are researching communities that are marginalized, it's really important for us to not make the situation worse for them in any way. And that could include, you know, accidentally revealing their identities, using data in our publications that they later delete. But once we put it in our publications, it's available for everyone. So there are all kinds of ways in which I think if for people who are new to the area in researching language and social media, the book that Majid mentioned when he was introducing me, there's a chapter on ethics, and that kind of points to some of the main areas that you should consider. But I also think you have to kind of, in a way, almost make it up as you go along, because there are so many different contexts that you could be researching, different kinds of data, different communities, different expectations of privacy as well, that I don't think there's any one set of universal guidelines that works for every kind of project and every kind of data as well.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, any questions from the floor or colleagues? Or any point that you want to elaborate on a bit more?
Yeah, I see Marina Niceforo raise a hand.
Okay.
Hi, hello everyone. And thank you, Johnny, for mentioning our project. And actually, I have a question for Massimiliano, although it can be open to anyone else. So if you've thought about possible strategies or uses of social media to contrast manipulation and conspiracy, I'm very interested in the way social media can be used wisely and effectively to, build informed knowledge and raise user awareness, for example. I don't know if you have any ideas about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Marina. Hi, hello. Didn't we have a discussion about that with Johnny himself, actually, at the end of the CADAD, of my plenary at CADAD, and with Paul as well? So how do we remedy to that? I don't think I have an answer to that, because, I mean, a lot of people tend to rely as a sort of revenge against, those who spread fake news. They tend to rely on fact checkers. And so yes, let's get the fact checked, so everything will be fine, etc., etc. But that doesn't work at all. And I don't think fact checkers have changed the mind of one single person. I may be wrong, but that's the impression I get. So that's one of really of the areas which would deserve a lot of attention, in particular from us who. Well, quite right. It was, to a certain extent, claimed to be critical of discourse scholars, but I think it's an area which really within the current affective regime, it is very, very difficult to address. Also because of the nature itself of the knowledge that is currently being spread on social media. So how can you? I mean, are we interested in facts after all? I mean, or rather, are a lot of people interested in facts? My impression is that, you know, people tend to be driven by emotions. They always do in all parts of life, of course. But when it comes to social issues, it sounds as if it really, and I'm pretty sure that Majid would agree with me, that emotions tend to be more and more prioritized in the current information and populist regime. So it's a difficult issue. I don't think I have an answer for that at the moment, as of January 11th to 2023. But that might change, hopefully.
Yeah, if I may add something, yeah, I do agree that this a tendency, you know, is that you say that do people really want facts? They don't, because this is part of the narrative that they're enjoying. You know, it's just like a film on Netflix. You know, it's like, hey, don't ruin it for me. You know, it's like, look at Brexit here. People are literally saying we don't want experts, we don't want statistics. Don't tell us how this is going to be bad, because we would like to think this is good, and it gives us good feeling, or we become, you know, energized with this, and we go with that. So and the human brain, as Michelangelo was explaining, it is set like that because it just deletes and removes any part where there is a conflict with what the joy that you're going through. Psychologically, that's the case. Whether or not, my question actually is always about, why is this happening now? Again, a big question for me is it really the normalization of social media practices that is causing this, or is it just a socio-political moment in our modern history that has, you know, it's like a full circle coming back? Because, you know, there's a big discussion really going on, because I often compare like Middle East and the East and the West in terms of democratic ideas and populism, and I always argue that populism in the Middle East, at least in a country like Iran that I know about, is quite normal. It was never really, it never went away, you know, within the past 50, 60, 100 years. But in the Western context, it did go away by the push of rationality, and argumentative rationality was the order of the day. And then we tried to separate emotions from the rationality, and then we downgraded emotions, and this part which was partly the reason for misogynistic anti-women discourses of saying that women are too emotional, so they cannot come to politics, but the whole democratic project was based on this discursive representation of argumentation. It was text-based rather than music-based, for example, or entertainment-based, you know. And now, of course, you know, there was arguments saying that these two were never really separated. Emotions and rationality were always mixed together, because that's the human. And then we have a full circle of people literally saying, we don't want that rationality, or it doesn't interest us, you know. And that's very interesting for me, which is I guess it's a very big question to contemplate on, really. That's why we, you know, I don't think, as you said, you know, I don't think anybody really, I mean, it does have an effect, you know, the fact checkers, BBC and all, but it doesn't really change the course of things, you know. It's just there as an addition to what is going on.
May I add something to what Majid was saying for Marina as well? First of all, I agree with you, Majid. People don't want to know, and people like Karl Rove know that. For example, in year 2000, I had a meeting with Jamie Shea, that was the spokesperson for NATO during the Kosovo War, And a few months after, he was part of a show by the BBC, How the World Was Spun, where he was clearly saying we wanted to manipulate and have propaganda on European public opinion. And my question was, how is it that you had a very good strategy and you made it public? And the answer was, well, you know, people are so stupid the next time they will not remember what we used. And if you see, then we had 2001 and Afghanistan, then we had the second Gulf War. And furthermore, the point is, as far as populism is concerned, that the populists all over the world are very well coordinated in terms of master narratives, in terms of consultants as far as communication is concerned. What we have seen now in Brazil with Bolsonaro and the people, it's exactly the mirror of what happened on Capitol Hill. But, you know, it works. So you have the Amazon shaman now, it was the Indian shaman, etc. The good news is probably that there is a way, because all of these tools and means are available to all of us, and it's reframing. Of course, reframing from a cognitive point of view takes a longer time, and this is why, as you were saying, Majid, how is it possible? Why now? But you know, these people have been working now for 20, 25 years on establishing narratives, etc. And this is where we can contribute to really reverse engineer all the narratives and explain how they work. This is something that is really, I see as a kind of social duty that we have towards society that is paying for our research, etc. But I agree with you, not necessarily they will be happy or willing to listen to this kind of, but instead of debunking that, as you were saying, people, you can show them that it's completely untrue. Think about Brexit. They knew that data were false, etc., but they want to believe in something else. But as I was saying, reframing takes longer, but is strategically more effective and ethically more ethical. So I feel that, of course, it takes a long time, and I believe it must be done on younger generations. I mean, we should care about the youngsters, because certain clusters of population are already gone in a way. It's like again, around year 2000, I consulted for the Commission for the European Years of Languages, and money was limited. And they said, okay, let's target youngsters, the one at kindergarten or primary school. We have to tell them that learning a foreign language is important. The others are older. And probably, as far as social media is concerned, we should do something similar.
Exactly. Thank you very much. Johnny?
Yeah, just wanted to agree with that last point. I think there's no point in debunking. There's no point in disagreeing. We know that doesn't work. As fun as it is to argue with people on the internet when they're wrong, you know, that really doesn't do anything. But I think what does help is working with two groups. First of all, children, as Michelangelo already mentioned. But actually, I think working with teachers is probably a more realistic approach, because we can't reach that many children, but we can work with teachers. I was involved recently in an EU-funded project on critical thinking in schools, and went to visit a number of schools in Norway and Spain and France. And, you know, the teachers were really interested in sort of thinking, how can we teach our kids critical thinking? And various sort of approaches were adopted throughout these schools and then shared with other schools and so on. So that kind of thing, I think we can usefully get involved in. And the other is kind of at the policy and regulation level, both in government and in social media organizations, in companies as well. Much as it can feel a little bit dirty working with social media companies, they are genuinely interested in what academics have to say about various things, because they want to make more money, of course, but also I think because they want to have at least a veneer of respectability to say, oh, we're doing these things to protect vulnerable groups or children or whatever it might be. So there are maybe some opportunities there to work with the policy leads in different social media companies, or the trust and security teams and so on. And with government as well, you know, thinking about how regulation around misinformation or hate speech or other areas could help, and kind of bringing our knowledge of hate speech in a wide variety of contexts to bear on that, I think is for me the sort of one glimmer of hope that we might be able to sort of bring about some kind of positive changes. But it is only a very small hope, because I think, well, we can see the way the world seems to be going. But, you know, we need to keep trying as well. That is essential, I think, to the critical discourse studies agenda, is to try and bring about positive social change in different ways. And so we do need to keep trying somehow, I think.
Of course, yeah, I do agree that the social media may want to cooperate to take care of some of the issues, but not because they want to be good. It's, you know, it's like, you know, the in nature of the problem is in the way the whole thing is, the corporate social media is designed, really, and they're not going to change that, because that's the way things are. But I do agree that it's a good time and moment where there are a lot of pressures for control and some level of regulation, especially in UK with new court cases against big companies. So they do want to, you know, fend off this sort of accusations, and that's a good way. That's good crack for us to weigh in and try to maybe make things a bit better, really. Yeah. Okay. I don't know.
I think we have we have no more time for questions. So that's the end of the seminar. But let me take this opportunity to thank again today's speakers, Majid Kosravinik, Paola Catenaccio, Michelangelo Conoscenti, Massimiliano De Mata, and John Unga. Thank you very much. And the next seminar will be held on the 25th of January and will be devoted to the social and emotional work of metaphor, hosted by Giuditta Caliendo, and the link of the seminar will soon be available on the website and on our Facebook page. And of course, members of the research center will get the link sent to their email address. And that's all for me now. If you have any questions about the seminars, please reach out to me at my email address, and I'll be happy to answer. Hope I'll see you at the next seminar, and I wish you a lovely evening. Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
This was really lovely. Yeah, take care.
Thank you very
Bye.
much.
Thank
Pleasure.
you.
Let's
Thank
keep in
you.
touch.